It's a great pleasure to be here with you. My name is Danielle Rached. I'm a professor at University of São Paulo. And today is we are wrapping up. Actually, we have one more session. Yes, but I'm super excited about our panel today. It's just climate transformation. And well, we know that the climate crisis demands us to have this transition away from fossil fuels. And this needs to be fast. And it also means that we need to rebuild the energy sector. But the transition to a low carbon economy, as they say, will probably harm communities, will probably harm the environment and the wildlife as well. So the idea of the panel today, and we have here different specialists in the field, and they work in different in different areas of research, and they are also activists here, is to discuss how to transition to a low carbon economy in a way that does not cause unfair burdens in a just way. So this expression, just transition, is not new, but it has become a buzzword after being introduced in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Words like being fair, inclusive, understanding pre-existing injustice are associated with a just transition. But what do they mean in practice? And what type of knowledge do we need to make this transition just? Who gets to decide the priorities of this transformation? So that's what I'm going to propose to my panelists here. And also we can have a quick word if you want, so you can choose if you want to say something about the agenda for the next 10 years. So the first person that I'm going to introduce here is Alfinito Vieira. You already know her. She has been working as a lawyer and a researcher alongside indigenous movements in Brazil. She's a postdoctoral researcher at FGV São Paulo and also at the University of Pará. So Ana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dani. Thank you, everyone. So we have a very short amount of time to speak about very complex themes. And I've been speaking to my colleagues before this table, so I know a little bit what we're going to bring. And I just want to set maybe the stage. And I'm going to be very controversial and critical because I know we're all tired. And if I don't give you this, you might fall asleep. I want to start by recognizing that, of course, the issue of climate transition is one of the most urgent issues and topics that we need to think about, that we need to pay attention to. But I also want to propose that this is not exactly or not only because we need to find out how to stop emitting a molecule into the atmosphere. So the predicament of climate change, of the sixth mass extinction, of the Anthropocene, of all these terms that are now in our imaginary, if it is to lead to just outcomes, it needs to open a much broader discussion about what we are transitioning from and where we are transitioning to. And the more that we focus this discussion on the issue of one molecule again, or of one greenhouse gas or greenhouse gases more generally, the more I think we miss a chance to expand our understanding of what the problems are that have brought us to where we are today, and to learn about broader social shifts that need to happen if we are to transition into something different, whatever that might be. So climate change addresses all sorts of imaginaries, fears, and scatologies. Is that a word in English? Scatologies. So thoughts about the end, and this puts us in a very specific position and mode of thought. When we're confronted with the possibility of the end of the world as we understand it, we seem to try to preserve the world at all costs, as we know it. So this is what the climate anxiety thing also is about. We know that something really has to change, but we don't know exactly what it is. And we feel that we need to preserve everything that we have, even if what we have is what's causing this near end of the world. So, when economies and governments tell us that you need to substitute your car for an electric vehicle, or that these kinds of individual shifts in consumption are the solution. For me, this is like we are deepening the cause of what brought us here, because we have a hard time detaching from our patterns of consumption, of production, our subjectivities, etc. So ironically, the issue of transition and of climate change is leading to a deepening of many of the conditions that have led us here. In a dialogue with Freud, I call this the extractivist compulsion and climate anxiety. It's a compulsion. It's like our death drive. We need to extract more. It's what comes even after the end is already here. It's like, no, we need more of this. This is what moves us. Now, so I know that we know about the large rates of commodity extraction that are going to be necessary. There's so many insights on this. I mean, three times the mining demand by 2030. I mean, and these rates are getting worse. And so I think that in the first place, for a transition to be just, we need to always and at all times repoliticize the transition. This is not a technical issue. We don't know exactly where we are. We do not have an agreement about where we're going. We need to imagine the impossible. We need to learn from improbable spaces of life, groups, communities, sectors. This is indigenous groups, of course, but not only. It's about opening the horizons in all of us, and kind of the strand of radicality that I think that we all have. So yes, repoliticize it. These terms are not given. We know that carbon emissions is a gigantic issue. I'm not questioning this, but I am saying that I think we need to go far beyond the transformations that we're proposing. Second, I want to propose that a just transition recognizes and takes into account, of course, the power asymmetries, global, national, regional, the differential impacts on climate change of indigenous groups, the importance of minority and racialized and indigenous voices, ontologies, peasant ontologies. All of this is very important. But I also want to say that it needs to take into account that the end of the world is also plural, that climate change is one way of thinking about the end of the world, that there are many others. So when David Kopenawa talks about the falling sky, he's not talking about climate change. He's talking about something very different. He's talking about a different experience of the world, of the end of the world, of how this can be avoided. And if we are to expand our way of thinking about our predicament, we need to take this very seriously as something different and something other. So I think this is what we're done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And if I have one word from Anna, then it's repoliticize the transition. So that's it. Okay. So the second that I'm going to invite is Thalia Uehara. Thalia is a postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg University and at Max Planck Institute for Comparative and International Law. She's also a researcher to the Center for Health Law Policy at Harvard. Thalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Please allow me to say that I'm overjoyed to be here sharing and exchanging with these fantastic panelists. I cannot concur more with your provocative statement, Anna. What I propose to bring onto the table is precisely how we as academics could, through our research horizons for the next years, could actually enable or disable this just transformation. So I'm going to pick up a couple of points that you left us with and try to follow up on them. First, by setting us in context. Where are we? What would occur over the next 10 years, over the next decade? Of course, I beg your indulgence. I do not intend to be oversimplistic, but I would just highlight some keystones or specific events that will resonate and that will be relevant as to how the world sees and intends to address climate change in the political, social, and economic fields, to then actually interweave and connect these backdrop with three prospective research agendas that would enable or would situate the academic sphere onto a segue of knowledge that could facilitate a world that is both resilient, fair, and that it actually advocates a vision of climate justice in the just transition. So first, what would occur politically over the next decade? We will have the conclusion of a global roadmap of development and human rights, which is the Agenda 2030. It will come to a conclusion in 2030 with a global review. Goal 13 will, of course, be reviewed. This specific goal on climate resilience does not contain specific and quantitative targets. Nonetheless, it will bring political momentum. What will also occur within the international climate change regime is that the world will experience at least 2 major updates of the national determined contributions cycle. Through the cycle that will that was due in 2023, and that will lead to a new updated version of the NDCs in 2025 and then in 2030. We will have a more refined global goal on adaptation, but also the national adaptation plans will be reviewed at least through 3 upcoming cycles. So there are the political milestones that will resonate over the next decade in how we address climate change. In the economic field, Malcolm yesterday walked us through a very encyclopedic overview of inequality, and then we are increasingly becoming aware that particularly the multipolar world in which we are entering and in which we find ourselves in will actually exacerbate the regionalization of global value chains. So we are now experiencing trade and capitalist globalization will not go away, at least in 10 years. What we're experiencing is the formation of more regionalized trade blocks. Right, so what would that mean for the management of climate change? What would that mean for national politics? And so those types of questions are the ones that arise. In the social field, as Alicia yesterday said, there's the gap between the private reach and the public poor will increase, especially within countries. And that, of course, as we know by now, that operates and it's highly entrenched and it's reproduced through distinctive social constructions, gender, race, ethnicity. So that is likely to become more acute. So the interstices connecting the political field, the economic, and the social, and with this I will finish this intervention, I guess is where we are invited as academics to recognize what Catalina just mentioned in her past presentation, the ways in which the macrologics connect with the local. So for instance, there are 3 overarching themes by which I believe academics, through academic research, we can push a just transformation forward, connecting that to climate justice. The first one is how global climate action connects to green neocolonialism and authoritarianism. So this raises generally the question of how this global push to increase greenhouse gas and emission reductions at the international level is influencing the rise of autocratic regimes and might fuel new forms of climate colonialism and green imperialism as global north countries or more carbon in-depth economies actually look for big land plots in the global south to offset their emissions. We have, throughout the past 20 years, we have learned a lot of experience with the REDD+ mechanism. When it comes to the interstice between the regionalization of global value chains, there would be a high tension between the international human rights regime with the international trade and investment law regime, which Elena this morning raised. So I would just pour out an example. What we have been for decades studying at national courts has now the potential to be undermined by investment tribunals, which operate under a different logic. So just in 2018, a couple of US shareholders of a Guatemalan mining company brought a case before an arbitration tribunal claiming compensation by the Guatemalan state of around $350 million, which in my calculations would amount to equipping fully 15 or 17 hospitals in the country. That has been raised by David Boy in his 2023 report. Who are these actors? Who are the lawyers that are feeding in international investment tribunals? Can we invite them to LawTransform? Maybe. So we can start these conversations. And finally, I'll just leave the issue of climate displacement on the table as an important component of and byproduct of transitioning to a resilient economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thalia. Thalia gave us a very good overview, but from a human rights perspective and a new climate colonialism, that was strong in your say. So now let me invite to the floor Esmeralda Colombo, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the European Institute of Economics and Environment in Milan. Esmeralda.
Thank you so much. So it's really a captivating conversation, I think, because when we talk about just transitions, at the beginning, it looked like it just concerns coal communities, fossil fuel industries that were supporting some communities in some parts of the world. But now, as Anna and Thalia have already anticipated, it's actually something that concerns all of us, right? And so the idea of a just transition, to me, is also the idea of bringing actions in justice. So, of course, something that is just is something that can be justified and made justiciable in courts. And that's also an emerging strand of climate litigation, just transition litigation, that is really being studied recently. Not even 1 month ago, a paper came out on it. And it's fascinating because we are justly legitimatizing also those communities that are against green grabbing. You know, so many square meters that are just devoted to wind turbines or storage, battery storage. For example, in Italy, just last week, there was a big demonstration in Tuscany. Can you just picture the hills in Tuscany and so many BESS, so battery energy storage systems that were destroying the whole aesthetic value of that land. So, of course, the communities of these tiny medieval cities would say, well, this is not the transition we want to have. Nobody asked us whether we wanted to have this. We know that this is good for the TSO, you know, the flexibility markets, everything. We can even make money out of it. But we are not interested in it because no one asked us about it. So I think there is a real problem of legitimacy. And one of the agenda points for the next decade, to me, is really the nexus between climate action, climate policy, and energy justice. You know, we talk a lot about climate justice and ecological justice, which is probably the overarching idea of justice, right? It cannot just be climate, it cannot just be energy, but still energy justice is being neglected, and probably with purpose, because we really want climate policy to advance also by decarbonizing energy systems. They are still they still represent 2/3 of all emissions. So it's a major challenge. It's a multi-level challenge because the electricity markets are so localized. It's not something that we can take at the COP level. And still, it's so complex. So energy is really one of the most complex fields where we need more understanding and better narratives. If we just talk about the doom and gloom narratives, you know, trying to persuade these communities in Tuscany, well, if you don't do that, the sky will just fall on your head and you will not be able to breathe during summer months. They're not going to do anything about it. They're not going to accept it. So to me, narrative, something that Shasti Flotsum and Andre were working and are working so well on, are fundamental. So what is the transformative narrative for climate action, not just climate change understanding, but climate action? How can people relate to that? And something that is transformative should really be about, I think, making everyone an actor instead of, you know, just a subject of some decisions top down. So one of the narratives, and this is probably my second and last point, is to democratize energy systems. So if we look into the climate and energy nexus, and then we look at what we can really do in terms of transformation, making everything more understandable, more actionable, then I think that energy communities and the fact that energy communities are enshrined in all major legislative frameworks in Europe are really some of the keys. So if those communities in Tuscany can really develop their own understanding of the best project, the best technology that we accept, then we can really make it more acceptable and probably fairer, right? So
thank you. Just to make a connection to your points, more democracy, repoliticizing the public sphere. I think that would be the connection that we have here, more conversation here. So now I have with me also someone who was here in the morning, Anwesha Dutta. She's a senior researcher here at CMI, and she's a political ecologist and who works on forestry and biodiversity conservation. Anwesha?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You know how in Australia and Canada, you start with this tokenistic way of mentioning you are on stolen land of so-and-so people? I think whenever I talk of climate in Norway, I would like to acknowledge I'm in a petrostate. And it's important. And that we are here because a lot of our research is indirectly funded by fossil fuel. And it's important to have that acknowledgement, you know. Having said that, I think I also like that we are calling it transformation and not just transition, because we are talking about an overhaul of these existing socioeconomic and ecological structures. But what that really looks like in practice, it's really very hard to achieve, right? Because what I see happening is the white savior complex turning into a white savior climate complex, where there is this increasing impetus from the global north to offset years of emission. And at the same time, taking a backseat when it comes to questions about reparations. Because you can't have justice without acknowledging historical injustices and accounting for reparation. And any form of climate justice needs to do that both, you know, in material ways, but also in other structural ways and so on. So that's very important. And the reason also that doesn't happen often is that because whereas you said, you started by saying that who's making these decisions and how are these implemented? And we have seen that happen again and again, whether be it pushing solar farms in India, which is now leading to, land use transformation, where grazing lands are overnight turned to solar farms. And then who actually is getting this energy? Because most people are not even connected to the grid. So this is all about, you know, a lot of this is, we are not thinking in a decoupled way. Yes, we have electric cars with batteries coming from Congo, you know, lithium mines and so on. So unless and until we decouple and disentangle, you know, the source of material, and not just to talk about, you know, this constant plundering is not getting us anywhere. So technocratic solutions is just mere, you know, you can't have growth. I mean, you know, I love this Journalia Martinez's work, because there is no circular economy. You cannot have circular economy because you cannot just continue to plunder, because there is no insatiable resources available. And this is why we have the kind of inequality that we see. And there's one thing I would like to mention, you know, and which is so important, is that on the one hand, there are these COP summits happening every year. There are all kinds of, the setting of these numbers, you know, 2 degrees, 30% of terrestrial land. And I actually did some, you know, with some colleagues. These are very arbitrary numbers that are actually rooted in politics and this whole thing of measurability and modeling. But actually, if you break it down, how is it that we needed to not cross 1 degree, but now we are okay with 2 degrees and maybe even at 3 degrees? I mean, some of it is, you know, yes, we need to degrow. And I actually, have increasingly started to, follow some of the degrowth work, because essentially we need to reduce consumption accumulation. And the final point I'll make is that no matter whatever climate targets, goals we set for ourselves, currently we are raging several wars. There has been studies showing what the emission impact of the war on Gaza is, the Ukraine war is, the Sudan war is. And if we continue to churn out, machineries and mechanics to wage war, I mean, this is a long-term industrial emission that we have to take into account. We cannot wage wars and then think about, just transition. So I think it all comes together, and it's a very interlinked conversation to be held with, capital, material relationships and communities. So thanks.
Thanks so much. From your talk, arbitrary numbers, 1.5, 2.0, and war. So, and finally, the most difficult name of today, Håvard Haarstad. Am I correct? Okay.
Very good.
Thank you. Who is a professor here at Human Geography and a director at the Center for Climate and Energy Transition at the University of Bergen. Please.
Transformation.
Transformation.
Anyway, thanks for fantastic points that have been raised already. I'll try not to repeat them. Listening to you all, I think what I wanted to say was, and this is a response to one of the questions we were asked to reflect on about the 10-year agenda. Like, what is interesting to work on in the future in this field? So my perspective on this is that when I started working on climate change and society, the main thing we were trying to push for was, now we need to get politicians to think about climate change, to talk about climate change, to do something about climate change. I think a lot has happened. So the discourse has really moved forward and really shifted towards where this is climate change policy has become part of the normal sort of policy landscape. In a sense, that's good, but I clearly see that there are things, there are difficulties that are coming with this, and the way I perceive this, and other people I think at our center, the SET Center, are kind of raising these increasingly apparent difficulties of working in the climate change field. And one thing I think comes back to what you talked about degrowth, and this was raised by several of you. And growth, the degrowth paradox here. So we keep saying we need to do something fast about climate change. We need rapid change. But what kind of things are we implementing when we are going to create rapid change? It's the technological solutions, right? It's the top-down solutions. It's the type of solutions where we don't have time to consult people. So yes, of course we need rapid change, but there are some huge problems with that. So, and I think that is a paradox that we need to address. I'm also quite sympathetic towards degrowth, but there are also problems in that direction.
Absolutely.
Right? So how do we cope with this paradox? We need rapid change, rapid reduction in emissions, although the rapid solutions that we know of are very, very problematic. And another aspect of this is, so where does democracy take place? Where do we need, we keep saying we need to consult people, we need people to participate in the decision making. But if you look around, what kind of decisions are people making about climate change policies when they get the chance to make those decisions? Not always in favor of climate change policies, right? Quite the contrary. We're seeing now what we are talking about as a greenlash, a backlash against green sustainable policies across Europe, and North America. So of course we need democracy, of course we need participation, but that is another thing that might mitigate against this sort of rapid shift that we also need. And the third thing that we are reflecting on a lot in our center is through this this increasing fatigue that we have as researchers and scholars of working in this field. It's becoming harder and harder to motivate people, young people coming into research, to invest their intellectual capacities in this area. Not because I think no one doubts that it's important, but because it's a hard field to work in. It's hard to see real progress. The types of progress that we're seeing, for example, electric vehicles, has other types of very difficult and challenging paradoxes built in within them. So it's a hard field to work in, and that's another thing I think we need to integrate into our thinking of what is the research agenda for the next 10 years.
Thank you so much. Fast changes, that would be the problem also, and lack of voice, maybe, yes? So with that in mind, let's open up for questions, and then I think I would like to have some one minute each here. Yes.
Thank you. So I want to bring in maybe two things. The first one is on the financing. So whether it's transition or the transformation, one of the questions that we're battling with at GRIP is the financing or climate financing, and we see it as an upcoming contestation, particularly for Global South countries. So last month at the HLPF at the UN, most countries that sort of presented the NDCs were Global South countries that are doing really well. And the ones that are emitting a lot don't bother to present. But that's where the money is. So the first thing is with Anwesha's point of we're sitting in a petrol producing country, Norway made billions of dollars during COVID and during the Russia-Ukraine war. And Michael Grubb at CU in London, they've come up with a number to say they could underwrite the loans and we would have the technology transfer and avoid the COVID situation where we had the patents not having vaccines going down to the Global South. So I wonder, in your take, do you see it as we see it as a sort of contestation of climate financing? The second one is the pathway. Rached came up with the eco-social contract, and they have 7 points on what we could do in order for us to sort of precipitate the global sort of eco-social contract and have a just transition or transformation. I wonder if you've engaged with that as well, and where you see that coming in terms of establishing sort of a pathway forward.
So I just want to, what are the main problems with degrowth? And so just give it to me, because that seems to me to be the only solution. And could it, okay, in a paradise kind of world, there will be degrowth in the north and growth in the south. How the hell do we get there?
Thank you. This was a fantastic panel, and in the spirit of being provocative, as all of you have been, I want to pose the other question, which is that, are we seeing too much of conflation of climate with other issues? Because these days everything is being put under climate. But for example, a lot of migration issues in India are not related to climate, but they are being presented as such. And what are the problems of too much climate?
Thank you. So one of the things I love about this panel is the way it tries to think more systematically about the climate problem. And I guess what I'm wondering is how we should think about, or how we should better imagine what the ongoing rush of climate transformation is doing to the solutions that we imagine. So let me give you one very parochial example from my own house, which is that I live in the state of New Jersey in the United States, which is one of the more progressive states. It's built wind farms off the coast because we're right on the ocean, to the point where almost all the electricity in the state is generated by green energy. Okay, so this is great. So here's the problem. Nonetheless, climate change is warming. We've had warming. We had an infestation of a particular beetle on a kind of tree that is extremely common in our state. What that's done is it's killed a bunch of trees, and the trees fall over all the time onto the electrical wires and take down the power grid so that all of us go back to the generators we were having before that. Okay, now the reason for mentioning that is A, it's frustrating, B, we can't get an electric car. But the main thing is that, you know, if you're focused only on electricity generation, and not on what's happening to the forest because everything's getting warmer and suddenly you have new pests that were going to interfere with all the wires that you put up. I'm just wondering sort of how the people who are really working on this are thinking about, even just in the natural world, before you even get into the political space, of how it is you keep up with actually trying to make these transformations. And we would love to get an electric car, but we can't. Sorry.
Yeah, hi, my name is Rasmus. I'm an environmental activist here in Norway. I worked with fossil fuel policy for a while as well. And in Norway, I feel like a lot of the conversation about just transition is excluded to only be about the workers working in fossil fuel policy, or in fossil fuel industry, sorry. So there's also quite a big effort from the trade unions who are unfortunately quite terrible towards fossil fuels, and one of the biggest obstacles for real climate action in Norway, to almost define just transition to exclude all other struggles than the worker struggles. So my question is kind of, how do we make sure that doesn't happen? And what kind of tools do we have to expand the concept of just transition when it's being limited in such a way? Yeah.
3 minutes. It'll be like 5 and then each one. Okay. Okay. Ana disse dia. No? Who wants to start? They are very difficult questions. No, you can.
Okay. Thank you very much for the questions. Yes, I will pick up on 3 on the interest of time. Thank you, Namita, for bringing the issue of the climatization of social issues. That's indeed happening. As the political economy that fuels climate activism grows, and that in the Latin American space, we have experienced, in particular in some countries, how unfortunately these global narratives tend to kind of eat in or override the local reality. That's for sure. There is another research horizon here. And then I guess that when these global forces clash in the political economy, then we're called upon as lawyers, as professionals working alongside frontline communities to develop the ethics of lawyering, right? What becomes ethic when it comes to working alongside. And there's been a few conversations on that space. Financing, Wesley, thank you for bringing that up. It will be a major topic in the upcoming COP29. Unfortunately, I feel it's from what I've been following, that this conversation is not on overhauling the full economic system. Yesterday, Alicia walked us through how the accumulation of private capital is that her statement was, in essence, there's plenty of money. We just don't know where it is. It's been hidden. And so there's enough, I believe, to walk us through a world of a resilient and economy, a resilient world. Just that how the regime is set up, articulated, the conversations are not happening that way. But there are some streams and organizations working on that. And the third point, then I will talk to you. Sorry.
I will make up for it. Degrowth, problem with degrowth. The word degrowth. In Norwegian, it's even worse. Nedvekst. It's very difficult for people to deal with. We need to have a word that suggests rather a positive alternative pathway or something.
Thank you, Anwesha.
Yeah, no, just a second to say that yes, I also share concerns with degrowth because it's still not very clear, and it's more like I would love a degrowth scenario, but how we actually get there, our current systems are not built towards that. So, and Namita, your point is so valid because climate reductionism literature came up in the 70s, and I feel by attributing everything now to climate change, the states are just shedding away of responsibility and accountability. And there's a brilliant project by Tor Benjaminson on Sahel, where everything's put on climate change, but his research actually shows that Sahel is actually greening instead of desertifying. And so I think we have to very critically also think of, you know, not everything is climate. I mean, that's the fatigue of it as well.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, so continue on that very important point. I was thinking, if you imagine we're tired, we who work in climate, you can't imagine how tired people who work on like old-fashioned land grabbing are, because it's really very urgent and very serious, and there's no funds because today funding is also for climate. And then people start doing research in climate because so many people come in, and then this contradiction of the oil state. So Norway is one of the biggest funders of indigenous rights in Brazil. And then so now indigenous peoples, they have to talk about climate. It's not all about climate, but now they really need to talk about it and use the language and the 2 degrees and the 5 degrees and the degrees. And then there's like a decoupling between the communities and the leaders who are linked to this kind of financing, which threatens the movement as well. So I think this is a gigantic issue. I also think that there's an issue of the conflict between climate and these other values and fields of the law. So environmental law and environmental justice and climate law and climate justice, it's not just that they're different, but that they're incompatible in some ways. And there's a literature on this as well. Like, how can we reconcile? Can we reconcile? Do we ultimately have to choose? And then last, because I didn't give my take on the research agenda, I think I would really like to see a lot more work on law and extractivism. This is just a theme that came up so much during this conference. It has to do with so many of the talks that we've had. How does law feed into extractivist forms, sustain them, you know, enable them versus hinder them, etc. So I think this is a field we need to keep mining from expanding 3.5 times in 10 years. How is this going to happen, and what's the law going to do about it?
Thank you.
So probably the last point is about eco-social contracts. I think it's actually very interesting that social contracts have risen again to the public sphere. I've been studying how much the social contract has affected throughout these 2-3 centuries our relationship with power. And it's not been very transformative, unfortunately. So Rousseau had this brilliant idea, but the social contract has been quite exclusionary to people that were not easily defined into frames, you know, binary and male and not children. So usually all people that could vote. So it's still exclusionary, and probably one of the main ideas about the contract is really for it to be synallagmatic, you know, you give, I give, doubt this. And this is not the way we should probably frame the idea of bringing different spheres into one planning pot where people have a say at least. So coming back to your question, how can we bring together biodiversity, energy planning, and you know, the energy mix to actually make it work as green as it is? So it's probably something up to episteme, you know, real knowledge. How can we create epistemic rights in a way, you know, so that we all get better knowledge about the decisions we are making? And we include people in climate assemblies. There are even youth climate assemblies where children can think about what they really love about the climate, what they want to, you know, contribute with through work in nature. So I think that some experiments at the social level, the level of social mobilization, can be complementary to any discourse about the social contract. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if you could join.
Yeah.